Hey, thank you for joining our AZ-801 course, where it's all about configuring Windows Server Hybrid Advanced Services. My name is Peter Detender, and I'll be your trainer for this module. This module is all about migrating servers and server workloads in on-premises and hybrid environments, where for this module specifically, we're going to talk about that on-prem workload. If you've been here since the start, you already know the flow where the first topic in the module is always touching on server-oriented scenarios, like really that on-prem characteristic of it. And then the follow-up module is touching on about the same concept, but how to look at it from an Azure perspective. And it's exactly the same for this module, where we talk about how to migrate workloads, but we're not really talking about Azure integration yet. Out of this module, I have three different sections to cover. The first one is touching on one of the prime services, I guess, in a Windows Server environment. It's running Active Directory and talking a little bit how to handle that migration. Next to that, we're going to talk about migrating file server workload scenarios using a storage migration service, which is part of the Windows operating system. And then closing this module, talking about a few other server roles and how to migrate them from one machine to another. So that, I would say, let's jump right in. So the first topic here is Active Directory Domain Services migration. Now, Active Directory is probably one of the crucial prime services you're going to run on a Windows platform. So before jumping into an actual migration, we're going to talk a bit about how to look into performing the planning, assessment, really doing that examination. Should we upgrade our servers or should we migrate from one virtual machine to another? Next to that, we're going to talk about how to upgrade your domain into that Windows Server 2025 flavor, and then also touching on how to migrate from a previous version. Instead of upgrading, it's moving from an old version to the new one. That's the big difference. And then one of the tools that we still have around, it's been around for a while, is Active Directory Migration Tool. That's going to give you a few specific migration options, which might still be valid for some of your organizations. Now, the first thing we need to think of is, what about upgrading compared to a migration? So what you can do here is migrating to a new Active Directory environment. So you might have your Active Directory. It was a service that went live in the year 2000 together with Windows 2000, also in one of my first years in the field. And I deployed, I don't know, never really counted them, but I deployed so many Active Directory environments for smaller customers, eventually all the way to multinationals. And every now and then, your Active Directory environment has been around for quite some time, typically a couple of years. And then out of that platform server migration scenario, you might also consider migrating away from the old model into the new model. For a lot of different reasons that I'm pretty sure we cannot even capture in a slide deck, but it could be because of an acquisition or a merger. Two environments running their own Active Directory, and at some point you want to bring them together in a single Active Directory forest. Or maybe there's split off. It doesn't always need to be an acquisition. You could also have a company splitting up in different business units, or maybe even shifting to a completely different business structure, where there could be a good reason, instead of having this one big Active Directory forest, to now maybe revise it and starting over. Maybe you're having a name change where you can play with that custom domain, but in the end, every now and then you still see the specific Active Directory domain names popping up. And that's maybe where the company might decide to, instead of keeping the old name, actually migrating to a new setup and starting from scratch. That's the main thing. And then last, what if you have an Active Directory forest that's maybe becoming a little bit outdated and you now need to revise it, maybe getting rid of legacy configurations? All of those, and probably so many more, are good reasons to think about a migration instead of an upgrade. Second option is obviously, well, we're happy with what we have and we just want to move into the later up-to-date version. I'm positioning Server 2025, obviously, because it's our latest version. But if you're still on 2012, 2012 R2, 2016, 2019. I mean, obviously, we're going to recommend you to migrate and jump to the latest version, but there might be some good reasons to maybe not jump to the latest version. Again, I cannot detail on all of that in just a video recording because in the end, it's so specific to any organizational environment. But just keep in mind that the high level meaning here is that you can do an in-place upgrade. You're running any kind of version of your Active Directory environment. Again, my assumption is preferably not always like super legacy, I would say. And that's where you're going to use that upgrade process. Now, in short, how does it work? You have your Active Directory. You introduce new member servers, like just adding Windows machines into the domain. And then from there, you're going to prepare your forest and domains, if you have multiple ones, for that upgrade process. You're going to introduce the member servers as additional domain controllers into the domains and forests. And then from there, you're going to transfer the Active Directory FSMO roles, as we call them, like the PDC emulator, the RAD emulator. There's a few different roles, I'm pretty sure. If you're into Active Directory management every single day, you know what I'm talking about. And then from there, you're going to give it some time to really allow all that domain controller information to replicate, to synchronize, right, across all the new servers. And then from there, you're going to decommission the old servers, remove them as a domain controller. And then if it allows, you could also remove them from the network. So 6 steps. For some of you might be kind of easy. In other organizations, this could actually take multiple months, all depending on the complexity. Another approach is, I would say, that upgrade, but then mixing in a little bit of that migration concept as well, where the big difference is that you're not reusing what you have. So it's a bit back to the previous topic where you run your Active Directory domain services forest and you're going to move to a total new setup. But now in this scenario, we also have not only migrating from an existing version into a new domain naming with maybe new servers and everything around it, but at the same time, we're also migrating from an older Active Directory version into the new one as part of the migration. A lot of different options there, where one of the challenges is obviously that, first of all, everything needs to remain in place, which means that as part of your migration, you want to make sure that users can still authenticate, that you're not losing any of your clients or devices as part of the domain, that all the passwords and anything else is nicely getting migrated. Now, to help you with that, and again, I mentioned this at the start, I remember, I think in the early 2000s, Microsoft provided a tool that we call ADMT, Active Directory Migration Tool. It was a super easy yet powerful tool, allowing you to migrate, consolidating domains within a forest, or even migrating to a totally new Active Directory domain services forest. The tool has been around for quite some years. I think officially it's no longer getting updated, but it's still supported. So a couple of highlights. What you can do with a tool is migrating users, hopefully pretty obvious. Migrating service accounts, migrating groups, including group membership, and then obviously migrating the computer accounts for clients and servers. And then the biggest benefit, apart from everything else, is also translating security for local profiles, which means that if you migrate from one domain to the other, you got your user profile, like all the settings on your clients, and that's now nicely getting moved into the new setup, which actually gives the user the impression that nothing's really been migrated. That's really how smooth it actually goes. Now, a couple of highlights here, where unfortunately I don't have a demo on how to actually get ADMT up and running. A big reason why is because it's not really that easy to take all the different specific scenarios into account. And if I start from an existing environment and just showing like how to migrate like 2 demo users and a demo client, it's probably not really showing you the powerful capabilities of the tool. But I can talk a bit about the process. So what you need to do is obviously having the correct permissions, because not all admin accounts should be having the permissions to deploy Active Directory migration tool. And then obviously next to that, the service account that you use to actually run the migration also needs specific permissions, all the way up to enterprise domain level, because it's really looking at the full topology of your forest and the domain, or multiple domains if you have it. And then it also needs to communicate preferably with other scenarios. Like you could install SQL Server. The assumption is that you're going to use that database as an intermediate where you can do the auditing, the logging, finding out who's already been migrated and who's not, and really using it as your migration strategy or the migration project management as well. So I would say if you consider migrating your domains from one environment to another, whether it's just upgrading the Windows services or at the same time migrating to a totally new setup, and you want to use one of the Microsoft products to help you with that, then ADMT would be the answer. Now, by the way, just as an FYI, it's not the only option. So you could also look into third-party tools, but that's obviously off topic for what we need to talk about here. That was Active Directory migration, where another workload scenario that is pretty common for a lot of you, I guess, is migrating file servers. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this next section. So in short, we already highlighted the recommended service to do this. It's storage migration service. So what I'm going to talk about in this section is obviously what is the service about, what are some of the specific use scenarios, how to implement it, and then obviously showing you what it actually takes to run that migration. Now, in short, storage migration service, I guess it's pretty obvious what the name stands for. It's allowing you to deploy that service within a Windows Server environment, and it's going to help you in storage migration. You might think about isn't it just like copying files, copying folders? Well, that's only, I would say, the technical vehicle of it, right? Because what are you doing with file shares? What are you doing with permissions? Like all that complexity that you might have instead of just copying files over, that's what storage migration service is going to help you with. There's a couple of different scenarios, and that's partly what the diagram here is for. So you might have a set of servers running on-prem where the baseline assumption is they're running the SMB protocol, like a CIFS, and that's where, if you look at some of those details, there's a Samba server that's like a Linux emulation of Active Directory on a Windows platform. You can have different versions of Windows as a file server going all the way back to 2008, and that's always still supported in storage migration. From there, you're going to define your migration strategy. You deploy an orchestration server. You have the source servers, like this is my actual source, and you're going to define your destination or target servers. Now, you probably know in the meantime, we like talking about Server 2025, but the good news is that storage migration actually is backwards compatible. Now, there's one little catch, like the main storage migration server, what we call the orchestration server, needs to be Server 2019 or newer. But then any source server, like the existing one that you want to get rid of, that you want to migrate away from, can go all the way back to Server 2003. Interesting enough, again, I hope my assumption, and that's just me as the server guy from the past, I just hope that you're no longer running Server 2003. But if you still do, there's probably a good reason, so we can't really argue on that. But the good news is that we do have that storage migration service actually streamlining, making that migration a lot smoother, and that could actually help you getting rid of that legacy operating system. A couple of screenshots next, but you can already assume that I got a live demo on that in just a couple of minutes. So starting point is deploy storage migration service, where preferably, as you can see here, we're going to drive it from that Windows Admin Center. Browser-based, easy management interface, so that's why we like using it. From there, it's going to perform that assessment, looking at what are all the different sources, looking at server configs, looking at the file shares, looking at network configuration, and other disk volumes if you have them. From there, we're going to start migrating the data. And the nice thing is that you can start the process. It's just going to offload all the data. And then all the way at the end, when you're actually ready to flip the servers, you're going to run the Delta migration. And then eventually, when everything has been moved over, you're going to get rid of your old servers. All of that out of that same intuitive interface. So actually pretty straightforward to use. Now, if I did not convince you yet, I would say this is a pretty good slide to give you that additional idea about like, hey, when should we use storage migration service? So when you have specific files that, for example, could not easily be migrated, you might still have a scenario where you need to do some offline file copying. So that could be one limitation there. You cannot migrate the identity of domain controllers. Why? Because we talked about how to migrate domain controllers in a different way. So it's not like I'm going to copy my sysvol database from my domain controller, moving it into a new server and done. That's not going to work because Active Directory requires that different way of migrating. A few other outsiders here is like the previous file versions, which you might have on a Windows machine, are also not getting migrated. And then eventually, keep in mind that you need to have that server 2019 or newer edition to run that storage migration service, but all the other source servers can be backwards compatible all the way back to 2003. And then a few side notes here, like obviously everyone wants to migrate as fast as possible. So that's where you need to make sure that the server alignment is done, which means a big beast of a server on the target side. But if your source server is not that performant, because again, it might be like 5, 10, 15, maybe more years old, then obviously it's not really going to speed up that migration. Bottom line message is go back to the planning phase, spend quite some time in reading through the documentation, and then get the migration running. And as long as you know what you're doing, you got enough time for it, then again, I can guarantee that it's a pretty smooth process. Enough talking about it. I'm going to show you in my next demo here what it takes to set up storage migration service, how to run that assessment, obviously in my small demo environment, running the migration, and then getting rid of our old source server. So this demo is showcasing what server storage migration looks like. Now, I have to be honest to again speed up the demo a little bit. I did the full pre-configuration, but I can walk you through each and every step. Just know that all the settings have already been completed. So the starting point is Windows Admin Center. So that's the interface you see here, where since we touched on backup, I could actually go back here and showing you that even out of the Windows Admin Center, we actually do have quite some integration with Azure. So in one of the previous demos, we touched on hybrid backups. So that's where you can follow up here from the server itself. It's connected to that AZ-801 backup vault. We're running this specific backup policy. This is the Azure subscription. Status of the latest backups, the next schedule, and then if my backup jobs were successful, yes or no. So quite easy to use, and I'll bring this back in later on in our monitoring topic. But now let's go back to storage migration. So the starting point when you enable this is giving you different options like, hey, where in your storage migration scenario are you right now? Do you need to create a job and define the definition, copying the data, and then in step 3, performing the cutover? So I created a job here. You could easily create a new job. You're going to give it a name. So this could be live demo. What kind of source do you have? And then from there, it's going to loop you through all those settings. So that's what I did for my other test scenarios. So let's use that one. So step 1 is create information about your inventory. So check prerequisites. And as I highlighted earlier in the presentation, anything all the way back to server 2003 or later would be supported. Even Linux machines with Samba and NetApp file system would also be supported. Obviously, you need admin credentials. You need required tools, which in my case means that I have clustering, since this was one of my cluster nodes as well, but I'm not really using it in my data storage migration. And next, we're going to define our devices. Now, I'm using one single server, but you could also see this as some sort of an orchestration, a management server, where you're going to add multiple servers into it. Once you add a device, it's going to ask you what kind of information from the machine do you want me to read out, where you're going to highlight what is the relevant data source. I just selected all of them. And then from there, it's going to give you the number of files and folders and all the expected information to integrate in your storage migration. Make sure you run validation first and then you run the scanning, because otherwise it might throw some warnings and error messages. Once all this is done, you click next, and that's where it's looping through about the same, but now touching on the target server. So again, it needs credentials for the destination server. You highlight what the destination server is about, where you can, for example, define a mapping. So this is the source, and what does it look like in the destination, where drive letters might not always be exactly the same, and they don't even need to be. Then next to that, even selecting specific file shares. So now we have a few options if you want to use a full disk or volume migration, or specifically starting on file shares. Once all this is done, you can define how you want to transfer, like what happens in case of failure. Do I allow you to retry, yes or no? Do you want to integrate with backup folders? Next, it's going to validate on the target server if you have the required components, where in this case, it's just validating if the storage migration service is running the validation of my target, and then eventually running the actual data transfer. Now here you can see that it couldn't transfer some devices. That's an error that I see coming up every now and then. I got my source, I got my target, and technically, as you can see, it actually worked out fine. And it's going to show you the progress. So since I only selected one share, like a small shared folder, only 3 files, and then if I bring in my target server, you can see that on my new data volume, it created a few temporary folders. One is empty in meantime, and then the other one has the storage right from the time we ran the replication. Then from here, when all this is done, we're ready in our last step, you could say, to perform the actual cutover. So that's basically disconnecting the old server, starting up the new server as your prime target storage environment. I'm not going to run through this process, but it's pretty straightforward. And again, the nice thing is also that you could start creating the jobs, and then whenever you want, like a few days before the migration, you would run a full sync. And then maybe the day of the migration, you could go back to the jobs like I showed you here and actually copying the deltas. So just giving you some highlights what storage migration service looks like. With that, let's jump back to the presentation. Good, that all worked fine. So I'm actually getting pretty excited. And we're not done with talking about different migration options. We covered Active Directory migration, we covered storage migration, but there's a few other server roles that we want to highlight. And that's really what this next section is about. Overall, you can deploy so many different services on top of that Windows Server platform. Now, if we take a step back and not really talking about applications on top, but really using some of those built-in services like DHCP, like DNS, and a few other ones, like really that core Windows Server platform that I'm pretty sure a lot of you are relying on, that's what we're talking about here. We run them on our existing servers, and we want to move them into new servers. So what that looks like is, again, another really beneficial tool that we have out of the Windows Server platform is overall called Windows Server Migration Tools. What it's going to allow you to do is migrating, for example, Active Directory certificate services. Still, if you ask me, one of the more complex services as part of your Active Directory topology and crucial for your environment, because it's really handing out those certificates for your clients. Next to that DHCP, the automatic network IP address allocation, I guess it's again one of those really core services with a lot of settings, a lot of priorities, a lot of exceptions maybe from your network environment, and you don't want to rebuild all of that from scratch. So that's where the migration could be beneficial. Same for DNS, same for network policy server if you're using that with your network configuration options. and overall migrating roles, migrating users, groups, and anything else that relates to that service account concept of any of those services. Again, there's nothing really wrong in starting over, like really rebuilding from scratch. But if your environment has been around for a couple of years in using DHCP, in using DNS, as I guess one of the core services next to Active Directory, isn't it cool that you can just run migration tools, flipping it over and done? That's really the benefit that we have here. So in short, how does it start? Obviously, you need to install the migration tools. It's part of the operating system, which means you go into your server roles and features, you're going to add the migration tool, and then from there you start your migration. What it means is you're going to prepare the source computer. So you're going to define a deployment folder, and from there you're going to think about your migration, and then eventually you're going to make it work. Most of it is command line based. So it's not impossible, it's not super hard, but at the same time, we don't really have that GUI to actually click around and make the migration possible. But there's, on the other side, only a hand of commands that you should really look into. You can get information about like the get migration server feature, exporting settings, importing settings, like really flipping over the configuration. That's what we're doing here. Good. So with that, we're basically at the end of this module. So let me wrap it up here. This module was all about the bigger topic, migrating servers and workloads in on-prem and hybrid, where for this specific module, we touch on that first aspect, primarily running on-prem workloads and how to migrate them. I zoomed in on Active Directory domain services, how to migrate or perform upgrades. Next, we touched on migrating file server workloads using storage migration. And then last, touching a little bit on other Windows server roles, primarily the built-in Windows, server characteristics, DHCP, DNS, Active Directory certificate services, and then a few other ones, but the process is not really changing. So with that, again, as always, I would like to thank you for having been here with me. I hope you're still learning, you're still excited about learning new things. And at the same time, I would like to invite you to join me to the second part of the module, where we're still going to talk about how to migrate, but this time again, zooming in on what it looks like in an Azure platform environment. Thank you for now, and see you again soon.